Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring how organisations can manage creativity. In the 21st century, the jobs people are doing are increasingly ones that require some element of creativity. Whether that's designing an advertising campaign, making engaging customer announcements on a train, providing a warm welcome and great service in a hotel or restaurant, inspiring kids in a classroom, or developing an innovative business strategy. As machines take the roles that involve little or no creativity, we as humans are going to be doing more of it. But the trouble with creativity is that it doesn't always lend itself to being managed in traditional ways. Unlike setting someone a task where they slavishly need to follow instructions, creative tasks require a different form of supervision. And the challenge with that is that as organisations try to mitigate the risk of creative activities, it's very easy to end up in situations where responsibility is transferred for the creative task, but the requisite amount of control to deliver it isn't. As my guest explains, when someone exercises control without responsibility and another person has responsibility without control, you get pretty close to the clinical definition of stress. My guest's name is David Meikle. He's a consultant to the advertising world where he helps companies to be more effective at hiring and managing ad agencies. In simple terms, he supports the users of ad agency services to get better value for their marketing investment. And as David explains, when companies hire ad agencies, or indeed any other form of creative, there's often a tension between the desire for the creative to be, there's a clue in the name, creative, and for the client to also retain control because of the perceived risks of handing everything over to the ad agency. The cognitive dissonance here is between hiring someone to do something creative that you can't do yourself, otherwise you would, and yet simultaneously being worried about them being too creative. What I'm going to explore in this episode is a challenge facing the ad industry and those who use it, but it also applies in other contexts. Whether you're someone whose work is creative in nature, and increasingly that is going to be more and more of us, or you're in charge of managing those who are producing the creative output, this episode will have something for you. So please enjoy my discussion with David Meikle on creative control. David, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thanks very much, Christian. I'm very glad to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here. And look, you and I know each other, but many of my listeners might not have come across you, which is why you're on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So currently I'm a consultant to the advertising marketing world. I work in this triangle of doom that's been created between marketing, procurement, marketers and their agencies. I'm in that area because I used to work in agencies. I worked in Grey Worldwide in the 90s on brands like Nokia and Ribena and Ben Sherman shirts. And then in the noughties, I worked in Ogilvy and Mather in London. And then during the brick boom, I ran Ogilvy Russia as head of country for Ogilvy Russia from the mid to late noughties, which was kind of frightening and exciting at the same time. And after that, I came back and started my consultancy business. And it was based on the insight that I'd gleaned over the years working in advertising that brands who employ advertising agencies often neither pay agencies either enough or in a way, i.e., the way they pay them, the way they're remunerated, incentivized, etc., or work with them or behave with them in the ways that are most conducive to the value that they want to get from them. So when I came back from Russia and I had some time out, I kind of thought that's a space that I really want to get into. So I pretty much kind of dedicated my life to that. In 2017, I wrote it up into a thesis in my first book called How to Buy a Gorilla, which was inspired by I know it does sound a bit strange. And in fact, believe it or not, the book distributors in America, you will believe it when I tell you, the book distributors in America said, why would anybody want to buy a gorilla without having read the fairly clear subtitle, which says "Getting the right muscle behind your advertising efforts"? So metaphors are clearly lost in some parts of the world. Anyway, so I wrote that in that was published in 2017. Got some really nice critical appraisals from the industry, and then I've been an intermediary whereby I find advertising agencies for clients and I've designed my own process for that. And now I've been continuing to do that, but I've just launched my second book called Tuning Up. And Tuning Up was based on a model that I published in How to Buy a Gorilla, but that when I presented it in workshops and used it in onboarding sessions for client and agency relationships and stuff, had really resonated. And lots of people had kind of shown a lot more interest in that. So I thought, well, when the lockdown came along, I literally had nothing to do. So, so I thought, deal with the corner of shame in the garden, write a book. And that's what I did.
Brilliant. And talk to me about people who are trying to hire ad agencies not doing it in the right way, because I think that's fascinating. Because if you sort of look at, you're going to spend money on something, then you kind of, like, it seems like a waste of money not to do it in an effective way. That's part of what I'm thinking. Then the other side, I'm thinking, well, that sounds to me like Adland isn't meeting its customers in the right place. So what's the cause of the problem here? I'm fascinated by that.
So I heard the other day, and this is really tangential. So I heard the other day that the width of railway tracks can be tracked back to the width of two horses' arses on a chariot in Rome, back 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And actually that's how we ended up with this bizarre width of railway tracks. Now, in a similar manner, if you were to say, what's best practice for working with an advertising agency now, I reckon if I had enough time and enough interview subjects, I'd be able to track it back, and I would track it back to Procter & Gamble. Now, that's fine, and Procter & Gamble is an incredibly successful company, and I've got huge amounts of respect for Procter & Gamble. However, Procter & Gamble have a unique set of business problems compared to almost every other brand in the world that's using the way that they manage agencies as best practice. So, for example, one of the case studies in Tuning Up is about a friend of mine who wrote an incredibly successful TV campaign for a shampoo that's good for treating dandruff, let's say. And it was so successful that Procter & Gamble said, it's the most successful we've ever had and we're taking it off air. To which the copywriter said, okay, but why on earth would you do that? And they said, because it's killing this brand, this brand, and this brand. We're a portfolio business. So Procter & Gamble's processes are designed to be risk averse and to maintain market share and nudge it up at very low risk. So they have a very specific low risk profile. They can often buy market share by investing heavily in media. They overpay their agencies compared to many brands because they know that they're asking for very formulaic, very specific kinds of work. And the only way to get good talent on that is to pay for it. So they've got a very specific set of business problems, and they're incredibly prescriptive in the way that they work. So then you take that to a competitor of theirs who has one brand in the category, and they start using the most risk-averse, conservative approach to managing their brand, when actually there is no danger of them cannibalizing other brands. That's the point of what it is that they'd be trying to do. But they've actually just thought this is the way of optimizing advertising, rather than, which is something that any of my clients or any of the agencies I've trained will know that I always bang on about, is you've got to start with the business problem. And people tend to start with the marketing communications problem rather than the business problem. The business problem is, we've got a number of brands. How do we grow this one without screwing ourselves of the other brands in the same category? So that's, I think, the source of it all. And risk aversion is a big problem. We don't talk about risk in advertising and marketing. And it's a problem in two areas. One, creativity is risk. There is no creativity without risk. In fact, there's no business without risk. Peter Drucker said, all profit is derived from risk. There isn't a way that you can avoid risk. You can only mitigate it or be risk savvy. And I think there's a lack of risk savviness in the creative industries, because we don't talk about it, and we ought to be talking about it. It ought to be part of the normal discourse. And one of the principles of How to Buy a Gorilla is you begin with your business problem, and then you define the risk profile of your marketing investment. Is it a high risk profile? Is it a low risk profile? And then you design your processes and your remuneration and incentives according to the risk profile that you've got. And that would affect your buying strategy. It would affect your incentives. It would affect your ways of working, your process of creative development. So that's one side. And the other side is, that risk in a procurement sense is, a good half of the brief. People in procurement are meant to be buying value and doing so whilst mitigating risk. But what tends to happen in the marketing arena is they buy for price because that's what they're incentivized by, and all of the risk of actually buying less for less is transferred to the marketer. So essentially they end up in a position which, according to, in my new book, would be defined as non-stick, whereby you have control without responsibility, and it's a lovely place to be. It's just not very nice for everybody else.
I was just thinking, actually, as you were talking, so many things to reflect on. But the one that got me was, if I think about procurement, you're right. It inevitably becomes, how do we get this thing as cheaply as possible? And I've never heard of a procurement department going, we should be paying more for this. But that's actually logically what you ought to be. You ought to be going, we're not going with this because it's crap, or we're not incentivizing these people enough to do things. The kind of thing that you and I intuitively know, if we're one-on-one, if we're working with someone, we'll have a sense of, actually, that's a bit, I'm not going to get the best out of them if I'm ripping them off. And yet, it's all one, it's one direction. And you're right, it's one single metric is, can you reduce the number? And so that they're not actually doing their job at all. It's a very blinkered way of looking at the world, which sort of says, if we keep the costs down, we'll have done the job brilliantly. And I mean, that might be fine if you're purchasing widgets where you can guarantee the quality is the same. But I think in the creative space, it's interesting because you almost, you don't know what you're going to get until you get it. And so prejudging what might be high quality is a bit of a nightmare. So I love that. I hadn't really thought about the fact that function it's not doing what it's supposed to do.
No, well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with the use of the word cost, because it's not a cost. Marketing is an investment. And as such, the reason that people who move into marketing procurement stay in marketing procurement is they say, oh, this is really easy. You ask them for money off and they give it to you. As well, yeah, that's because if you went to your investment broker and said, that $1 million I was going to invest, I want to invest 700,000, they'll still say okay. And it's the same with an advertising agency. I can, good, quick, cheap. Which two do you want? It's the same thing with any kind of investment, and with the advertising business, you tend to find that advertising agencies respond to what they think they need to do to keep or win the business. And if procurement is telling them you need to drop your trousers on the price, then that's what the agencies will do. If, however, you say to them, well, I could do that, but it would vastly increase your risk, so I think we ought to bring marketing into that equation because this has big implications for them, then, of course, that changes the dynamic somewhat. And, of course, the other issue about creativity is that it is necessarily inefficient. So if you've got procurement trying to buy creativity, and creativity is... So there was an excellent podcast the other day with John Evans interviewing Ian McGilchrist about the creative process. And there's all sorts that we've learnt about that. But the most important thing about creativity is that it has to have space. It has to have the inefficiency of space and time in order to emerge. You have to, what he was talking about in terms of what McGilchrist was talking about in terms of how the brain works, is you have to actually almost be not doing in order for the creativity, for the ideas to arise. So the whole premise of trying to make a process which is creative more efficient is to drive out the very thing that it needs in order to flourish. It's like saying, let's build a great big fire with carbon dioxide. It's not going to work. So one of the reasons that I think if we look at the state of creativity now compared to where it was in the 70s, 80s and 90s, I think pretty much everyone would agree that it's disastrously poor, with exceptional pockets of Christmas and the Super Bowl. But even those sometimes are disappointing. But it used to be that creativity was much more free. Brands were much less afraid. They were much less conservative. They were much more open-minded about their brands, and there was much more license. So, for example, one of the things that I bang on about in tuning up is how prescriptive clients can be. So this is the other part of what clients do that doesn't help them. And one of the things that was always played to me whenever I presented a piece of work that did this, it would say, you can't make the consumer look like an idiot. So you could never have a victim in an ad. Don't make the consumer look like an idiot. Okay, so Could you explain to me how that's not happened in the Hamlet ad in the photo booth? Because that's really humiliating somebody beyond all measure. In fact, pretty much every Hamlet cigar ad humiliated people, and they were incredibly successful. So don't think the consumer's such an idiot as to assume the persona of a character that you put in the advertising and then identify with it and then think it's a brand for them. The point is, it's a brand even for them, because the point of advertising is to dramatise the benefit. So if this is going to make a loser of this magnitude feel good because they use a Hamlet cigar, imagine what it will do for you if you're not a loser. That's actually what's going on in the ad. But people don't think about it like that. They just, they hear these little pearls of anti-wisdom, like don't make the consumer look like an idiot, and then they adopt them. And they become law, and they're falsehoods.
And I think that's a really interesting point around, less creativity happening nowadays. When you look at, I don't know, movies, for example, why do we get the rinse and repeat on these franchises?
Oh.
Because it's the safe choice, right? We'll just, because that worked last time, we'll do it again. And it's as you were now. I know there's a natural tendency to look back, because I'm getting older. There's a natural tendency to look back. Oh, it was much better in the old days, and therefore, when I do think about advertisements, I look back more fondly. But I love that point you made about the Super Bowl and Christmas, because you're right. These things are sort of fated as, no, this is going to be great advertising. Well, why are you limiting yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Why would you think, hey, I'll save up my really good stuff just for Christmas, and for the rest of the year I'll just roll out crap.
I'll just be ripping shit, right?
Yeah, and obviously that makes no sense at all. You've demonstrated that your brand and your agency are both capable of doing better work. So why are you only taking those risks with your brand when it counts most? when you put the most advertising dollars behind them in Christmas or in the Super Bowl, you'll do your riskiest work. But why then wouldn't you do that for the rest of the year, particularly when it keeps proving successful?
And I think the thing that's interesting as well is when you think about what happens nowadays is that ads that are good will be watched by people because they're good ads. And we're not, it's not in the old days. It was sort of, you'd watch it on television, it would appear on television. But actually, if you hear that an ad's really good, it can go viral on social media and you can go watch it anytime. So in many respects, actually, you can, it's not as if, if we make an amazing ad, no one's going to see it. Actually, the nature of social media now means, and other forms as well, mean that we can, think things that might otherwise have been hidden would be visible. So I could see an argument back in the day that says, okay, we'll pick those really high profile events because that's when there's most eyeballs on it. And if we catch them, then that's a good. But that doesn't apply anymore.
No, it doesn't, and in fact, it hasn't done for quite a while longer than you probably first think. Because one of the case studies for How to Buy a Gorilla was Sainsbury's Christmas ad, which was about Mog the cat, and I don't think that was actually broadcast. I think it was only online. It was one of the first big heavy investment social first campaigns. Terribly effective, very 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 good business results. But yeah, it was absolutely social first, and the Cadbury Gorilla, which was the inspiration for the name of the book, was one of the first ads to ever go viral, because that was sort of 2010, and YouTube was just sort of picking up momentum and market penetration, and it was hugely shared across social media. So yeah, social's definitely changing, and there's again, we're now getting into the space of social first, and that opens up another whole tin of worms between. This is also going to really affect process. I'm going to probably have to do some work on this, but you'll then end up in the position of, well, this is what social media really likes. Well, that's fine, but is it what your brand wants to say? So you're going to end up in this terrible place where there was I don't know if you saw it. There was an Ocean Spray piece that was this Hispanic-looking guy on a skateboard listening to
Fleetwood Mac, I think.
Fleetwood Mac, that's right. And it was just a wonderful mood, and it was sweet. He was an ordinary-looking guy skateboarding down the freeway at sunset, drinking Ocean Spray. And loads of social media agencies were sort of posting on this going, see, who needs advertising agencies? There's just natural creativity in the world. Well, yeah, except that might not be the best at targeting kids if you're trying to target kids with ready to drink, or it might not be the best at targeting, at targeting catering if you're trying to target catering with your cranberry juice, if you're trying to do on sales. So can we start with what it is that we're trying to do and then see if there's something that we can do with social to make that work, rather than let's just scattergun crazy ideas and hope that one of them will gel with the audience for a fleeting moment. The point about good advertising is it stays with you as well. And I think a very nice Hispanic friend has been forgotten already by most people.
Right. But I think you're hitting on a point here, which is the kind of how hard can this be? So unlike, I don't know, if I was bringing in a plumber or someone doing something highly technical, unless you're overly confident, you're going to recognize there's a skill set that you don't have. And the reason that you're bringing in a plumber or whatever is because you need their help to do it. Well, advertising is, of course, particularly nowadays, is look, we can all do it. And look at all these people that can do amazing stuff on social media. So to your point, there's a presumed level of expertise. And of course, some people are good at this, right? Clearly, if something goes viral, it does it for a reason. Sometimes it's the algorithm, but sometimes it's but there is some talent there, I'll put it that way. But just because you've stumbled across one formula that works quite well doesn't mean that you necessarily can think outside that, right? That's what you've done. That's your thing. But there is this perception that it's not really that hard. And I guess therefore, well, I'm hiring these people to do something, and I could see an argument that sort of comes into, well, the only reason we're getting them is there's a little bit of market insight because they do this all the time, and maybe they can think slightly more broadly than we do. We don't have the time to do all that stuff, but actually, frankly, if we had a few more people, we could do this in house. And so that perceived level of confidence, I guess, would drive how you might approach this particular service provider.
And I blame Steve Jobs for that because.
I think I know where you go, but go for it. Yeah,
because I think there has been in the last 30 years the democratization of creativity, and it's created millions and millions of rank amateurs. And the problem is that everybody's baby's beautiful. So if you're able to create something because you have the technology, I'm talking to you through a MacBook Pro. I could create amazing things on this if I was skilled that way, but I'm not. However, I can create a presentation that I think looks great, and my 14-year-old will look at it and tell me how I could radically improve it because he's really good at design, and I'm not. So you have to remember that there are skills of craft in being able to persuade with typography, in being able to persuade with design and colour, that very, very few people are really, really good at. But just because you're able to change the colour of a background in a presentation doesn't make you a designer. And and I think that's been lost. So too many people are taking. I mean, this is part of the client agency relationship problem, that many clients are taking too much control, and then they still make the agency responsible for the outcome. So this is where the model in tuning up works, is because essentially the client takes control without responsibility and leaves the agency with responsibility without control, which is a clinical definition of stress. But what tends to happen then, and this is where it goes into a downward spiral, is that the outcome of working in a place where you're kind of dictated to make my logo bigger, change the colour of the background, blah, blah, blah. When a non-designer is telling a designer what to do, you start with resistance, then you get angry, and then you give up. And once you give up and you're in a place of learned hopelessness, then all you put out is mediocrity. And that's why I think, generally speaking, the industry is producing a lot more mediocre work than it used to, because it's just learned hopelessness, and there's a desire to hang on to business because the margins have been cut. It used to be that agencies used to make a reasonable margin. I mean, they used to make 20, 30, 40% sometimes of gross profit across their whole business. And now there are many agencies who will make 5 or 10%. And therefore, your ability to say to a client, I'm really not sure that we're what you need anymore, you ought to find someone else. Maintain the integrity of your product. Maintain the sanity of your people, is much more limited, and we're eroding the talent pool that is needed to reverse the trend and to enable greater creativity. It's a problem, one that Orlando Wood has identified at System 1. It was Orlando that put me onto Ian McGill, Chris. But yes, it's empirically unequivocal that creativity, humour, charm, all of these qualities in advertising create better results. Yet the way that most clients work with most agencies is almost as if to avoid it.
It's interesting as well because when I think about other contexts, stuff I remember, I don't remember the bland. I'm going to remember the restaurant that served me amazing food. I'm going to remember the comedian that made me chuckle about something I'd never thought about before. Yeah. I'm going to, the experience I've never had. And we tend to forget the things that we've seen lots of times before. And so it seems to me that on a basic human level, we all understand this. If I go through life and nothing, I don't remember days when nothing extraordinary happens because there's no point, right? Our brains are changing. And so the bit I find really interesting about this is when you look at, okay, if we're in the business of grabbing people's attention and getting message across to them, then it ought to be blindingly obvious to all involved that actually you are going to need to push the envelope a little bit because otherwise you're not distinguishable from other people. And if your purpose is to distinguish your product from either create awareness or distinguish it between yours and others, then you need to push those limits.
Yes, but I think what's difficult to have some empathy with clients here for a minute is that it's very stressful to just let go to your agency and say, tell me what you think we should do with this. Just help me out here. I'm not sure where we should. Here's what I need to achieve. So there is a brief. Here's who I think we ought to be talking to. Challenge away if you want to. But once we've agreed on the basics of what it is that we're trying to achieve, knock yourselves out. That's a really tough thing to do. But when you do that, you get so much discretionary effort out of agencies. I mean, if agencies are in a position where they've got control and high control and low responsibility, you get extraordinary discretionary effort because this is our opportunity to make award-winning, groundbreaking work. And when you're in a position where your risk profile is such that actually that's really what you need to do, just fill your boots. You need to go to your agency and say, help me out here. This is an emergency. Do your best work you've ever done. That freedom, I think that most people, most of the time, want to do a good job for somebody else. And people don't work in the service business if they don't want to do a good job for somebody else. The parallel that I drew in tuning up, which is talk about not remembering boring days. So I used to go on holidays, hot holidays, for boring days. I wanted boring days. But one thing stood out on holidays that I went on with my girlfriend to Greece, is that we would go to a restaurant for lunch and I would order a Greek salad because that's all I wanted and I knew what a Greek salad was. And she would say, oh, I'll have the chef's salad. And I said, what's the chef's salad? He said, well, it changes. You never know what you're going to get. Each restaurant is different. But every time, this incredible thing, the same price as a Greek salad, by the way, but twice as large, twice as interesting, many more ingredients, flourishes, extras would come out because you basically said to the chef, what's the single best salad you can produce? And it was always going to be better because you've given them complete control with very little responsibility other than your satisfaction, which was, hopefully you'll come back if you like it. So when you give people, when you're generous with that kind of freedom, you're giving them the oxygen for creativity, then they're much more likely to do a brilliant job and come back and deliver you the value that you're seeking.
I love that. And actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, they've put their name to it, right? This is the chef's salad, right?
Absolutely.
Let's not blame the Greek, right?
No, I mean, in fact, I do it in restaurants now. So it's, again, something that I've written about is if I'm ordering a steak now in a nice restaurant, caveat, it has to be a nice restaurant, and they say, how do you want it? I'll say, just tell the chef to cook it as if he was cooking it for himself. And then they go, well, that's a strange instruction. Say that to the chef. And they say it to the chef, and wow, they pick out the finest cut. They pay much more attention to it. You're always going to get, if there's a choice of whether or not you get the ropey one or the nice one, which one are you going to get? If there's a slightly larger one or a smaller one, which one are you going to get? If you're saying, I trust the chef implicitly. Do the same with taxi drivers. Which way would you like to go? You know better than me, mate. And they'll say, well, actually, I could probably save you £3 if I drop you here and you walk through that alleyway. You get value back by trusting people and by saying to people, you know what you're doing far better than I do. Fill your boots.
I mean, of course, the cynic would come back on both of those examples and say, well, David, what you've done is you've given the chef the opportunity to get rid of the slightly older ingredients that they can chuck in there. And in the cab driver's case, you've given them carte blanche to do the opposite, which is to take you the rip-off journey, the longest one, because you clearly don't know what you're talking about.
So let me refute both of those. So example number one, the late, great Anthony Bourdain mentioned in Kitchen Confidential that in many restaurants they will have a pot of steaks next to the grill, marked "waiting for well done," and these would be the ropiest, nastiest, the ropiest, nastiest steaks. That if you're going to cook the bejesus out of it, I might as well give you shoe leather to start with. There's not wasting a good piece of meat on you. So you'd wait for a well done order, and you take out the ropey steak and take it from there and put it on the grill. So that's refuting number one. Refuting number two, the taxi drivers. I think the two things that are extraordinary there is taxi drivers very rarely get people who are really nice to them. And if you're really nice to taxi drivers, then they will reciprocate. And the second thing is that the way that taxi driving is billed actually makes it in their interest to pick you up and drop you off as quickly as possible, rather than to go the circuitous routes that all the cynics think they're taken on. So, gotcha, both times there.
But I think, I mean, the argument I would always come up with is okay, even if that happens occasionally, the broader dynamic, it's a portfolio 100%. Game here, right? So if your approach is, because you don't know when you're placing the order or the instruction, what's going to happen.
Quite right.
And so actually, if you take a portfolio approach and you say, well, fine, I can be ripped off or served these slightly older ingredients once every, 10, 20 times.
Exactly.
Right, but the other times it'll work for me, and so on that basis.
And what's your real risk? Your real risk is a couple of quid on a taxi fare, or a meal that isn't brilliant but was pretty good. So you're not really risking much, but at the same time, it also makes your life so much easier. Because I'm constantly, when people ask me how I want them to do something, I say, well, how you think it's best, and if you want my further involvement, let me know. Or if you want to check in with me, let me know. But frankly, over to you. This is what happened to me when funnily enough, this was before I developed the Meikle matrix, which is the model central to tuning up. But I had understood the insight, which is responsibility and control need to intersect where they're both high for you to get the best performance. But I had just taken the job almost exactly 20 years ago. 20 years ago tomorrow, I arrived in Moscow in the snow, staying in the Mejdnarodnaya, and I couldn't say that for 3 weeks while I was there, the Mejdnarodnaya Hotel, which is the International Trade Center Hotel, which was very near the Ogilvy office in Moscow. And the night before I started work, I sat with Leonid Shutov, who was the owner of the affiliate agency. And I said to him, so I guess over the next few months, we'll kind of figure out what operational control and decision-making you want to retain on a case-by-case basis, and we'll feed it through rather than trying to think of every scenario. And he said, oh, no. All you tomorrow. It's all on you tomorrow. Tomorrow, you run the show. I'll be around. So if there's stuff you want to check with me, if there's stuff that you need me to help you with, I will always be available to you. But no, you don't need to check with me. Just do it. And that was it. And he just said, you've got complete responsibility and you've got complete control. And I just, well, this is bloody marvellous. And it was. I mean, it was a fantastic part of my career, because I got to do. I mean, if you think about it, if I'd said to an owner, well, what I want to do is I want to reduce your profit by 20 points, because it was a very profitable agency. I want to reduce your profit 20 points. They'd have said, you're absolutely mad. But I was incented on revenue and a minimum profit level, and I managed to reduce the profit but double the revenue in the first year, just because people hadn't been investing. And it was still one of the most profitable agencies in the Ogilvy Europe network. But I was just suddenly released, and I was giving everybody responsibility and control. So why can't I do this? Well, I haven't got a printer. You haven't got a printer? Well, go and get a printer. And then suddenly, oh, that bottleneck's gone. And why can't we do this? Well, we need to hire somebody to do that. Well, why don't we hire somebody to do that then? Oh, okay. And then suddenly that bottleneck's gone, and the agency started to work far better than it had done before, and it grew 500% in 4 years.
Wow.
In revenue, and 300% in people. And that was all by using that principle, responsibility and control.
Yeah, no, and I love that. I love the idea of trusting people and freeing them up, because I've always taken the view that, sure, there are going to be some things that you absolutely do want to control, things that are non-negotiables.
Yeah.
But actually, in many cases, provided we've hired the right people, right? If we give them some autonomy and ability to solve problems, and we remove impediments, we get better output, right? And it always struck me that when it comes to human capital, we often constrain it in ways that we wouldn't constrain other things, because we sort of, well, goodness knows what might happen. We don't know. They might do all kinds of crazy things, right? And I find that's interesting in sort of, you know, contexts that are less creative. Although, you know, back to your point about democratization of creativity, I'm seeing it seems to me that actually human beings, with certain exceptions, working in a nuclear power plant would be a good example, where we don't want any creativity whatsoever. But
you kind of write stuff down for that one.
Right, yeah, that's a sort of more of a checklist environment, I would argue. Right?
Absolutely.
But if we look at the average person, we're hiring people more and more to be creative on some level. And so I think we need to recognize these dynamics that you're talking about and sort of say, well, actually, there's a greater risk in not freeing them up and overly controlling them in many cases than there isn't. And so I loved it when you were talking about that freedom, because I'm guessing the culture that you came into, it sounds like in many respects, you know, if they have a printer, well, let's get one, right? Let's fix that problem. It's kind of like, well, the world is the way it is. And you remind me, I spent some time in East Germany after the wall came down, and there was a kind of like, well, that's just, you know, can't fix that. It's not working today. I was like, well, just get a new one. We can't do that. Well, we can, and we will, and then we move on. And I think there's something really very nice about looking at a world where we start from the premise that we need to trust people and empower them, as opposed to retrench them. And that's, you know, what I'm surprised by is that was, you know, came across that a little bit in your world, because I would have thought from the outside of the act, you know, I always advertise, you know, it's not helped by, you know, TV shows. We can think of the ones I'm talking about, you know, where you sort of think, oh, well, it's a bit freewheeling wild world. But actually, you know, I guess there's a natural tendency to sort of humans to behave in a particular way. And what you're doing is really trying to unleash that potential.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think part of the time when I took a role in senior management, i.e. leadership of the agency in Russia, I moved into what's a very deferential environment, and one that wasn't very mature in terms of the advertising world. So they'd had brands and they'd been advertising brands for a while, but not for, you know, 100 years. And we've been doing it in the West for 100 years, and they'd been deliberately not doing it for a vast part of the previous 100 years. So I'd come into some naivety, but generally it was because societally it was a very deferential society, very hierarchical. And you had to kind of break through that to get any kind of efficiency, because otherwise, I mean, literally on my first day in the office, there was a queue outside my office before lunchtime, people asking for decisions. And pretty much every time they'd come in and they'd say, "What should we do?" I say, "What do you think?" They say, "I think we should do this." We'll go and do that then. Next.
What's your purpose? Posting whatever you think the answer is the answer.
That kind of became apparent fairly quickly. But yeah, it was a very strange culture, but it's one that we changed. And the other thing that changed with it is that by doing this and by running the business that way, by not just I mean, the cliche is empowering, but it's not just empowering, it's also listening to and not trampling over. So it's not just sort of do what you want, but it's also, for example, I had a new business opportunity. I had a couple of new business opportunities that were interesting. One was for a brand called Rostix, which was the Russian equivalent of KFC. Now, the background is that account had gone across 4 different agencies with the same creative director over the previous 20 years. So the same creative director would take it with him wherever he went. and he was now at a new agency, but it was going to be bought by KFC. So they were obliged to include us in a pitch, for which they faxed us a brief on Monday and said the pitch is in a week. And I said, well, we at least ought to have a meeting. No meeting. Phone call? No phone call. So we're not pitching for this. And I kind of got an email from New York saying, this is part of the young group. We ought to be doing this. Why aren't we doing this? And I kind of went, well, you've got problems on the ground to fix here because I'm not wasting my time. I'm not going to be responsible for taking part in this when I've got absolutely no control over the process at all. This is just a farce. Plus, we know it's a fix. So that was one example. And another example of responsibility and control is when we were invited to pitch for Melina, which was the equivalent of nectar in Russia. And Melina is Russian for raspberries. So you collect raspberries as you shopped. This was a big brief, and it would have been a good win. But my advertising group was up to their eyes. My activation group was up to their eyes. So I finally went to the head of my Ogilvy One group and said, "Do you want to pitch this? There's a lot of it's a lot of data-led stuff. It's a lot of DM, email, etc., etc." He said, "We're dying. We've got Pfizer going crazy. We've just won. We've got IBM going nuts. We've got Amex launching. There's just there's no. I just haven't got the resource." Now, in most agencies, the response from a CEO in most agencies, well, you don't like it? Start liking it. That's your best bet. Start liking it. Find a way. That's what you need to do. And I said to him instead, I said to the guy's name is Brian Lee, and I said, "Brian, are you going to hit your numbers this year?" He said, we hit our numbers a couple of months back. I just haven't had time to tell you. So we're absolutely beyond target. I said, "Fine, just leave it then. I'll decline it." And I turned down a pitch that would have been an easy win for us, but we just couldn't do it without causing ourselves some serious damage. And as a result, the loyalty, the mutual respect that you get from your management team when you work that way, the turnover, the staff turnover in a market where it's about 45% went down to 12.
Wow.
Because we built this culture about, if you know what you're doing, do that. But if you don't know what you're doing, just put your hand up.
I love that idea of saying no to things because I think it's relevant in any business. Because I hate these things where you get a sort of round of redundancies or something, and then it's like, well, everybody else can just work a little bit harder. And you sort of think, well, you've just chirped a load of people, you've made everybody feel insecure about their jobs, and then you're going to expect them to work. I mean, it's just insane on any level. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And I get that you can all muck in when there's an emergency, but when the emergency becomes business as usual, that's not a great way to live it. And so I love this idea of you sort of sitting there thinking, well, actually, this is just not a good idea. And we're not going to flog people into the ground for something just for the hell of doing it, being seen to do it, whatever. Because I think that's very human. And it strikes me that particularly in a creative environment, there's all the stories about, oh yeah, well, if you get people working longer hours, they'll come up with more ideas. It sort of feels logical, but that's not how creativity works. And actually, you need to free up the capacity. And you don't, to your earlier point, you're not giving people the time to just reflect and do things that are pointless in the moment, but actually useful in terms of getting creative. So I love this idea that that's even a question in the creative space, because it seems to me that if there's one industry that ought to go, well, let's hold off on that because that's going to undermine the product, it ought to be in the creative industries.
100%. I think what's really interesting is that this idea of discretionary effort I came across a long time ago, right? And it's discretionary effort is I can go in and do my job the way that my job's described to me, or I can do my job and then some. And one of the benefits of clients who work with agencies in a, let's say, a progressive way, what I would describe as a progressive way, by giving the agency time, by listening to the agency's requirements, by giving them latitude for creativity. One of the things that they get back in spades is discretionary effort. So they'll be paying, they might be paying £500,000 in fees, but they'll get probably 700,000 in effort, because that's the brand of all of the brands that they work on. That's the one that they take home with them in their heads. That's the one that they think about in the evening when they're watching telly, or they're a bit bored, or they're cooking, or they're showering. That's the one that they take with them. And when you're taking with them, when they take your brand with them, you're getting all of that for free. And because they bring it back to the office the next day, and then they work it up into a strategy, or they work it up into a media plan, or they work it up into a creative idea, and you go, ta-da! And you've had all of that extra oxygen that you've not paid for, just because you've not been an asshole.
Right.
And it's extraordinary how much discretionary effort you get from everybody when you behave in a way that is respectful to them about what it is that they do, by giving them the responsibility and control to do their best work. I mean, I remember even thinking about it. This was the real test, and it was a kind of a personal test for me. So last year, I randomly felt really, really ill all of a sudden, and it turned out that I needed an operation on my gut. So I'm lying in hospital in Oxford, talking to a surgeon who says, we could just give you some more high-powered antibiotics and hopefully it'll go away. Or you could go under the knife kind of now-ish.
Right.
What do you want to do? And I went, I want you to take complete responsibility for my well-being, and I want you to decide what's in my best interest to do. And he said, I'm finding that quite, he kind of evaded that answer. I said, okay, so imagine I'm your son. So,
right.
Okay, preparing for operation. So that's all I needed to know. How do you get to a place of understanding, getting that truth out of somebody about what they would do if they had all of that power? And we rarely say, if it were up to you, what would you do? It used to be something that I think was much more common, that we used to ask one another, if it was your problem, what would you do? And instead we kind of, I think we avoid that more, and I think it's to our detriment. I think it's to our loss.
But all of this stuff comes back to, if you step back and think about the basic human dynamics, nothing you're saying is, and take this the right way, nothing you're saying is revolutionary in the sense of you're just thinking, well, I agree. Sometimes, and I mean that, but no, because I think we miss this often. And the value you're adding is going, just hold on a minute. Let's just have a look at what's going on here. And so my point about I'm not saying you're making statements the obvious, therefore nobody should read your book. It's the opposite. It's actually saying what you've done is stepped back and kind of looked at the world and just gone, let's just think about what is going on here and why that might not be a good idea. And therefore, how could we make something happen that is a good idea, that's more likely to give us better outcomes? And so I love it when you step back at these, but I think we don't often freeze frame that. We accept, if I look at models of the world, this is the way we've always done things type logic.
Yes.
Which is fine if it's a good reason, but often you can't explain why it's a good reason. You're just slavishly following protocol.
Yes, exactly.
For no good reason. And we know that's not intelligent in any other situation. And so I think what's really nice about the way that you talk and the way that you write is that it's making it comprehensible level. I find myself reading your stuff nodding and sort of thinking, that makes perfect sense. And it's obvious with hindsight. Yes. It's not obvious if you haven't taken the time. So that's what I meant by that. Just in case you or anyone else was.
So the reason I'm laughing is that I've been doing this book tour. So if you underwrite buying a whole bunch of books, and I'll come and talk to you for an hour or so and answer questions about tuning up. And I had this kind of moment of mild panic because a couple of people have read it and went, well, that's bloody obvious. And I kind of went, well, yeah, but do you do it? No. Are you going to do it? Yeah. So it's still useful then. And I heard this thing the other day that I thought is my answer. So now my answer, well, that's really obvious. I said, yes, but we put a man on the moon before we put wheels on suitcases. I'm in the wheels on suitcases business here, and it's a really good idea. Yes, it is blindingly obvious that you shouldn't have responsibility without control. But how often are you actually framing things like that and talking about it? Because when you do, as I did, when it first happened to me 20 years ago, and I found myself in a state of near panic attack, permanent panic attack, felt like I had a 10-kilo weight on my sternum because of the work pressure I was under. And finally, after trying everything to get rid of it, a doctor said to me, your problem is you've got responsibility without control. That's the first time I heard it.
Right.
And that was my aha moment. And in that aha moment, I reframed about 5 different relationships I had in my life in real time, sitting in the doctor's office, and this weight lifted from my chest in real time. So for me, that was the diagnosis was the prescription. It was also the treatment, and it did the job. But I thought I'd just caught up with the whole of the rest of the world who already knew this. It's only subsequently that when I translated it into a model for client agency relationships that I found more and more people are saying, no, I'm absolutely stressed off my bits trying to do this work. And now that you framed it like that, I can have a different conversation. And when you have a conversation to say, yeah, I'm not feeling that I've got a good balance of responsibility and control here, it's making me quite stressed. What can we do about that? It's difficult to argue that you should just lump it. It's difficult to say, yeah, but I kind of like it like that, I've got control without responsibility and you've got responsibility. That kind of suits me. It's very difficult to argue that credibly as a human being without exposing yourself to be the proper asshole that would take that position. Generally speaking, people will cooperate with you and they'll say, yeah, that, okay, I see that. And that's what happened with me. I'd got myself into a position making one set of ads with colleagues in the States where I got completely stressed. I had this insight. And then when we were making another set of ads, I said, that process isn't going to work for me because I've got responsibility without control. You need to put control in me in this office to do that campaign. And after a bit of negotiation, that's where it got to, and we did a great job, and I wasn't stressed. Had I not done that, could have been a cardiac arrest at 30.
I mean, we laugh about it. It's not funny at all, right?
No, it was horrendous at the time, but it made that big a difference, as obvious as it is.
But it's interesting because the word obvious is what that's basically saying is I understand where that's coming from, right? That that works with me. So in many respects, things that are obvious aren't necessarily obvious. It's conclusions that we are happy with.
Yes.
We're conclusion. And I think part of the reason we say it's obvious is, I could have got there myself. In other words, I'm accepting of that answer. And I think the funny thing is, to your point, is often people go, well, it's so obvious. Well, why aren't you doing it? If it's that blindingly obvious, why haven't you been doing it? But why didn't you think of it yourself?
Yes.
And so I think it's a compliment, ironic, and I meant it as a compliment, you know that, right? I meant it as a compliment because actually what I think you've managed to do is land with people. It's resonated. And therefore you've got a message across to them and they're comfortable with that message and they can process. This is not causing them any problems whatsoever on an intellectual or any other level. So, okay, light bulb comes on, go. But somebody needs to switch that light bulb on. And so I love that. And of course, that's good given your background. You ought to be able to do that because you've been in the business of grabbing people's attention and making them think about things in a way. But of course, I guess the reason you've written the book partly is because many people in your industry haven't had that opportunity to stop and think about it.
That's right. What I've tried to do is frame it in a model that's relatively simple, and in a way that you can conceptualize and use constantly, rather than one of those models that you have to kind of, where did I put that bloody model? Which presentation is it in? I need to go and find that and figure out how it works again.
It cracks me up when you get like acronyms or things. So there's something, and then people go, "What does that stand for?" Right, and you've lost you've lost the point of the acronym if it's not obvious, easily remembered.
Simple, measurable, and the rest. those objectives that are reasonable. Oh, maybe that's the R.
Right.
Yeah, no, I can't bear complexity for complexity's sake, but at the same time, I think that one of the things that we haven't done in advertising and marketing is embrace a degree of complexity. We do try and dumb things down too much. What I really like about this is about this model, and some of the feedback I've had has been very pleasing and echoed the way I feel about it, is that it's quite simple to adopt. So you can think about it in terms of pretty much any. I mean, Blair Enns, who I don't know if you're familiar with Blair Enns, who's the author of the Win Without Pitching Manifesto. So he read this book in a couple of days before I did a podcast with him a few months ago and said, I fail to see how I won't look at every personal and professional relationship I have now going forward through this lens. Because why wouldn't you? If someone's asking you to do something, or if you're asking somebody to do something for you, why wouldn't you apply that lens and kind of just see whether or not what you're asking or being asked of is reasonable vis-a-vis the intersection of responsibility and control?
Right.
And it's that simple. And it's just a quick red flag that says, yeah, that's okay, or no, that's not okay. I mean, you can imagine I'm working at the moment on a couple of new business things, one of which is in the public procurement arena. So I'm having to adopt, and it's weird, public procurement processes seem to be designed to achieve the absolute opposite of what most procurement processes for creativity are designed to do. So, I mean, my clients might be mentioning it, but you know, there are processes that are imposed on a process that I would never adopt, and I just have to say, okay, you have to recognise that this is the outcome, and I can't be responsible for that because that's not what I'm recommending. That's not what I would do. I would actually do something counter to this, even though it's not within the rules. But unfortunately, you can understand that people have to stick to the rules when they're working for the government.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
Apparently,
If you're procuring PPE, then you can have control without responsibility completely. Apparently,
Wait.
That's not a problem at all.
But as you were talking about it's funny you mentioned Blair because I've literally just come across him, and so I've just been playing catch up in that space. So it's coincidence. So I'll put a link to his stuff in the show notes for people, along with links to all the other things that we've talked about. But I mean, it occurs to me when you were talking about, well, why wouldn't you apply that lens? What I think is super interesting is back to the old comment. I forget who said it, but the point is one of Thaler or Sunstein, I think, around there's no such thing as neutral choice architecture. In other words, when you are making decisions, you're applying some sort of process to come to that decision. It might just be gut instinct. It might be what you did before. It might whatever. And so what I think is interesting when you talk about your piece and how to apply it more broadly is it's not like you're saying, now stop what you're doing and impose a process on this, because that process is already there. It's just that you haven't thought about it before. And so actually, if we can make better decisions by bringing in a process that isn't reliant on luck or just what I happened to do last time, which, what you did last time might be the right answer, but wouldn't it be better if we had some sort of process for managing that? And I think often when you read stuff, the good frameworks, the good matrices, and I loved yours, are things that you can just slot in, where you can just sort of say, okay, this doesn't feel burdensome. I'm not having to stop the world, go, hold on a second, let's analyze what's going on, right? You can slot it into the natural flow.
Yeah.
And then it just replaces, or actually probably a better way to look at it, augments what you're doing already.
Yes.
Because I think one of the things I thought was neat about your way of thinking is it's not the unpalatable message of, you've been getting this all wrong. Let me show you how to do this correctly. What you're basically saying is here's a way to augment the way you're doing already. And so I think things that are additive are super helpful in that context. And I just love this idea of something that you can apply in other contexts as well. I think frameworks that are useful, where I can make things work for me personally, as well as in a work context. I get used to using them more. They sit in the natural flow. And it's not just this weird sort of, here's a work thing. It's actually useful to you. And I think things that are useful to us in our personal lives, we pay more attention to.
That's right. When we moved into this house, we had an extension built on the back. Absolutely, I said to the builder, who I went through a bit of a process of selecting a builder, and I finally went for
a procurement process.
Oh, a bit of a selection process. I must say the price was a factor. But it's
it ought to be on some level, right? Because it'd be weird not to.
Yeah, of course.
Money is not what factor, right?
And I only had a certain finite amount. So, But one of the things that I said to him, and I find this incredibly useful when you're asking somebody to do something for you, is if there is something that I need to do to create an environment in which you can create best value for me, you need to tell me what it is. What are the circumstances I need to create for you to be able to do your best work? And that's a way of giving even more control than you would normally do. But by asking that question, you're in a place where you can find out what you didn't know, because you don't know what you don't know. So you can find that out. You can usually do something about it because the suggestions are usually not to do with yachts in the Caribbean or whatever. They're usually well, what you could do is you could leave me the hell alone for a couple of weeks to get my head around this. That would be a reasonable answer. You can hear all sorts of things, and for my builder, I was doing exactly the same thing. You tell me what you need. If there's a building inspector coming along, if you need me there, you tell me what to say, you tell me what to do. I will do exactly what it is that you need. So you are in complete control of this project, soup to nuts. And he did a brilliant job. he did an absolutely brilliant job, and he went off because he said, so why it's an interesting way of working you've got there. Cigar, I wrote this model. It's in How to Buy a Gorilla. He went off. My builder went off and read my book. My first one, which is all got absolutely nothing to do with building, but he was so enamoured with the model he went off and read it. Anyway, but yes, ask what you can do to create the circumstances, and that's not a bad place to start.
And I guess I think and this requires careful management of the relationship. But I think I'm thinking about the flip side. I mean, one of the things I'm working on in my business is to say, actually, and how you phrase it's critical. But I'm thinking about how to get the best out of me, and let me tell you up front what things that and typically, of course, it's not how to get the best. It's how to not get the worst out of me, right? So it's almost stuff that makes my life harder. And if we could just not do some of these things, that would be super helpful. Recognizing that you're the client, and of course, there are certain things you're going to want to do. And what I was reminded of is that when we spend a sort of time in a kind of client provider relationship, is that you end up with often it's all the way the client wants. And actually, to your point, often the client doesn't know. And if they're spending money on you, then wouldn't it be a good idea to try and give them a little bit of a user manual as to how to get the best out of you? And sure, ultimately, the client pays the bill. If they really don't want to do something, then they have the right to say that because they're paying money. But at least help them to sort of get the best out of you. And we recognize that, at least in theory, internally within organizations, where we try and design people, we don't necessarily do a great job, but like we listen to, but what are your career aspirations? And we pretend at least to try, but we don't think about that with a sort of client provider relationship. And I really like that idea of thinking, actually, if you're going to spend money on something, then understand the dynamics that will make that spend more effective. And then, some of it you may not be able to do, but if you can, then that's a great way to, and it's back to where we started with that procurement logic. Is like, how do we get the best out of this investment? Well, the answer is we create conditions where it can flourish.
Exactly.
And so to finish us off, just anything, firstly, I guess anything that we should have talked about that we haven't covered, because we could go on forever, I know, but is there anything that we ought to have picked out?
I think that what's interesting for your listeners particularly is I don't think you're necessarily in my sweet spot of an audience, and why this is relevant is that I've already got interest coming in from other categories outside of marketing and advertising. Yes, you can see how it plays to marketing and advertising, and actually I had to write it for marketing and advertising because that's my background and that's what I know and that's where I've got some credibility. But my publisher read the intro, the first 3 chapters. She said, "This is me. This isn't just about advertising, but this is me. That I can relate to where I am in this." And oh God, it's been helpful. And then I've had another conversation about somebody who works in emergency care in the NHS about how responsibility and control can affect people on frontline emergency care. I can see this extending into all sorts of different categories. So I would welcome conversations with anybody outside of the advertising and marketing category, because I'm just interested to know where it can go. I can't see it doing any harm anywhere, and I can only see it doing any good anywhere. So I kind of think, well, the more the better. And let's start those conversations and see where it might lead us. The other thing that I've done is develop this as a diagnostic tool. So if you go to the website tuningup.co.uk, you can use a sort of rudimentary model that I have there, whereby if you input the name of your relationship and you ascribe to it a degree of control that you perceive you have and a degree of responsibility that you have for the state of the relationship or its outputs, and it will plot for you where it is on the Meikle matrix according to how much time you spend. And by doing that across a number of relationships, you'll be able to see how much time you spend in each of the four quadrants of the matrix. And that's quite useful. I'm developing that into an organisation-wide version, which will hopefully be out sort of middle of next year, whereby organisations can use it as a staff wellbeing and staff productivity tool to assess if people are largely spending too much time with responsibility without control, or have they got responsibility commensurate with control, and then retest to see if their subsequent interventions or changes in client relationships or changes in management or changes in process improve the amount of time on aggregate people are spending in flow as opposed to spending in stress. So that's another application for it that I'm quite excited about, and I can see that could cross industries quite well too.
And look, I think your analysis is spot on, right? Hence, and people can infer this because hence you're on the show. Because I read it and thought, actually, I'm a huge fan of picking things from one discipline, seeing how they might apply or not apply in others. In your case, I think this is universal, and I come back to that.
Yeah,
man, it's got me thinking about how we talked about practical examples that not everybody's having an extension built all of the time.
Yeah,
we do go to restaurants, we do use cabs, we do, we engage with people, and so I think that's an interesting one for me. Is if it makes sense in that context, that gives you a good opportunity to think, well, this is probably relevant for what I do on some level at work as well. But even if it isn't, then you've got some skills that are useful to you in your personal as well. So I absolutely agree with that read across, no question about it. Comes highly recommended. I will put links, David, to that, your websites, in the show notes, and anything else that you send me afterwards. But all that remains to say is I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for being an amazing guest.
It's my pleasure entirely. I've really enjoyed it too. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to David for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about David, his books and the work that he does, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes that you might have missed in the past, visit the show website at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Remember to think creatively about how you manage creativity, and thank you so much for listening.